And I think one thing that's different, maybe in my experience about AD from maybe other INGOs that are experimenting with participatory grant making, is that we're making quite a wholesale change. So we're not saying we'll just make it a part of our existing programs. We're saying we will phase out our existing programs. We don't think that the role for AD is to be implementing programs, and we think full scale shift away from our own programming is the right way to go because of all the things we talked about.
Hello, welcome to the podcast, The Power Shift, Decolonising Development. I'm Professor Kate Bird, and today we're going to speak to Fredrick Ouko and Mary Ann Clements, co-CEOs of ADD International. Our conversation today explores ADD International's structure, their roles as co-CEOs, how representation matters, and how participatory grant-making challenges the colonisation of resources. Listen on for more.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Kate. Hi, Mary Ann. Hi, Fredrick. I'm Charmaine Macaulay, and I just want to say welcome, welcome. Welcome to the Power Shift, Decolonizing Development, the podcast series seeking to bring together thinkers, practitioners, and activists to share ideas, inspire change, and identify tools for practical action. I'm Charmaine Macaulay, a body psychotherapist, Director of Kokoro and lead facilitator of the groundbreaking training program called Racism in Real Time. And my co-host is the wonderful, talented Professor Kate Bird, Director of the Development Hub. As a Black psychotherapist and a white development professional, we're using our own lived experiences and professional skills to frame the way that we approach the topic of decolonization. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Charmaine. So today we're talking to Fredrick Ouko and Mary Ann Clements. Fredrick and Mary Ann are co-CEOs and transformation officers at ADD International, an international NGO which fights for the independence, equality and opportunities for disabled people living in poverty. Fredrick co-leads ADD's work to become a participatory grant maker. He has worked for the Open Society Initiative for East Africa and Light for the World Netherlands to advance disability rights. He founded Action Network for the Disabled, a national disabled people's organisation in Kenya, and Riziki Source, a social enterprise using tech to improve employment access for disabled people. He's an Atlantic Fellow, was elected an Ashoka Fellow in 2012, and was shortlisted for the Africa Prize for Engineering Innovations in 2016-17. As well as being co-CEO and transformation officer at ADD with Fredrick, Mary Ann is also a feminist writer, facilitator, activist, and coach, committed to building a better world together without replicating patterns of injustice. She co-convenes the Healing Solidarity and her Embodying Change coaching practice, which centers a genuine solidarity that is focused on healing injustice. Previously, Mary Ann has worked as executive director at Able Child Africa, regional representative at Basic Needs East Africa, chair of Lambeth Women's Health Aid, and as an assessor at Comic Relief. For more on Mary Ann and Fred and the work of ADD International, please click on the show notes below this episode. And I pass back now to Charmaine for our first question.
Thank you, and a hearty welcome once again. Fred and Mary Ann, as Kate has just said, you are joint CEOs of AD International, and are guiding the organization through a process of transformation. Can you explain why AD has joint CEOs, one based in the majority world or global south, and the other based in the minority world or global north? Can you describe how you divide the task in transforming ADD to become an anti-racist and decolonized organization? So this will be for both of you. So who would actually like to start first?
Yeah, thank you, Kate and Chairman, for this opportunity to speak on this platform. So really, AD as an institution, our board made the decision 3 years ago to really center the rights and the lives of people we work for. And this informs why we have co-CEOs. Actually, we do have co-board chairs as well. This was made from the fact that as human beings, there are instances where you need some sort of collaboration and thinking together to solve a particular situation. And when the decision was made to have two co-CEOs to help the organization transform, it was just that we needed to have people from representation of where we're working from, and people with lived experience of disability. And that's where we actually ended up having myself and Mary Ann, who by fate, we've worked together in our previous lives before this particular position. So it wasn't that there should be someone from the north or south. It was just that The board wanted someone who has a lived experience and someone who is from where the organization has been situated or registered or working from across the globe.
And Mary Ann, would you like to add your perspective on that, which would be great?
I mean, Fred said it really, that the board committed to this wider process of transforming what was quite a traditional INGO really into an organisation that, we'll talk about it more as we go through, but is really changing and transforming. And as part of that, really recognised that it was important to model that in the leadership of the organisation. So they've also made sure that over 50% of the board have lived experience of disability and also heritage from the global south or majority. They were really keen to model that. And it's actually easier to model it at board level more quickly than it is with your staff team, because with the staff team, you have to wait until either people leave or it actually takes time to change your staff team. But your board, you can change quite quickly because the board can decide to bring on more members and things like that. You don't have to create new roles and then pay people. So the board realised that actually we can change quickly. Some people can transition off, or in fact, they decide to have a slightly bigger board for a bit. And we can get very quickly to at least 50% of people on the board being majority world and people with lived experience of disability. And actually, I think they're getting to the point where they're over both of those and could probably go further. And the same with the CEO. You can make that decision when you're recruiting. So it was really about modelling that kind of, maybe sharing power is really more the sort of language we use. Obviously, they connect all the ideas around shifting power as well. But I think that if we were to leave and add to recruit again, they could recruit 2 people from the majority world with lived experience of disability. Like, you don't have to have a person who's in the global north necessarily, I don't think. You obviously have to have someone here because we currently have a registration in the UK, and that was originally kind of conceived of as our head office. So there is sort of some legal and administrative things that you do have to have here, but increasingly our whole staff team, we're looking at almost all roles as being for anybody anywhere in the places where we operate. So we're not confining very many roles to any geography anymore within AD. So that could shift and change. But I think that the key thing that's important is that lived experience leadership and really modelling the other changes we're making at the leadership level so that our staff and partners can see that we're serious about them, I think. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Which actually leads into my next question is, can you describe what steps ADD International is making to decolonize, and how your organization's public commitments contribute to this? So you've alluded to that, but I'm asking more for a clearer definition of that. And this is open to both of you again.
Yeah, so our principle of decolonizing is just making changes and not theorizing about those changes, like living the changes we want to see. For example, an organization has existed for over 35 years. It works with persons with disability and supports them. So it means that for it to be able to get concrete ideas and issues around disability, there has to be people with lived experience on the decision making. That informed the choice and the decision to ensure that our board is 50% persons with lived experience from all these parts. We're working from Asia and Africa and UK as well. The fact that our leadership is the one that is visualizing where we are going, in charge of distributing resources and ensuring that we are following up on the plans we have for the organization, it so goes that those who are leading, those who are within responsibility within that leadership, as SLT, senior leadership team, that there's a representation of persons with disability and people from all the areas you're working in. And that's just a common sense issue, because you don't need a conference to discuss that, because it's a clear way through how you move, how you walk the talk. And the board said, can we then have on our SLT this kind of representation when you are recruiting, when you are appointing people to the SLT, can you then have a look at where does the directors come from? And we've just ensured that our directors are representative from Africa, Asia, and the UK. So it's just a common sense thing that you have to do in terms of how then do you move and walk the talk, and then follow up with resources. So when we allocate resources, we're also thinking around what do we need to be doing in Asia? What do we need to be doing in Africa? And who's responsible and who's making a decision around that? So really nothing very technical there, just about when we've decided that we're going to shift, we're going to share. We actually just need a shared kind of perspective in terms of when we're making decisions. That enriches where the organization is going. It's not just about participating within the discussion around shifting the power. No, it's about a shared goal whereby if we want to be a better organization, that responds to the needs of people we are serving, then even at our leadership level, that has to be represented, because then we get the nuances of every decision that we make is informed by their lived experience and from how they show up into those meetings when we want to make those decisions.
Thank you, Fredrick.
Let me pick up a few things. So we've had internal conversations about what does it mean to decolonize, right? And of course, like, decolonization is this broad concept. Some people relate it very much to the sort of political decolonization of colonized nations. Some people relate it a lot to working practice and how we do what we do, and all things in between. We found that our staff had like a massive range of views about what this is, could be, should be, and also that they differ quite a lot dependent on their positionality, the kind of conversations they had and hadn't been involved in, both in the development sector and beyond it. But in our new strategic framework, what we've actually said in terms of the key way that AD is trying to decolonize is that we're trying to be a kind of force for change in terms of unpicking the problematic thing in the disability and development space quite specifically, which is that rather than funding and resources getting to organisations of persons with disabilities, the funding kind of gets absorbed by international NGOs, and very small amounts of it gets passed on. So that kind of colonisation of resources and the funding system in disability rights and justice work was something that we'd both seen for many years, even before we came to AD. But it was also something that was in kind of AD's founding principles, because AD was founded to be in solidarity with disability rights movements in the 1980s, but it over the years had become more and more of a sort of professional INGO. And so we felt that the right way for AD to decolonise was less of kind of localise our country offices, because they weren't necessarily staffed by people with disabilities who were leading the work. They were staffed by great people who knew how to manage projects, because that's what AD was doing, right? And they were predominantly almost entirely staffed by people who were local to the context, but not necessarily to the lived experience of disability, although some of them were. But we felt that the right way for AD to decolonise is get out of the way of this funding flow. So that's the key thing that we're trying to do in our new strategic framework for the next 10 years, is to enable the flow of funding and resources more to the people who've always been AD's partners, so organisations of people with disabilities that are led by and for them, who want to create change in the world. And so we've said that actually decolonising, as it were, that funding system that absorbs the money means those people don't have power and agency and resources is the thing that AD can do. And the ways that we'll do that is by the participatory funding that we're going to do. We're also doing, and Fred's leading on this, can talk more about it perhaps, but a leadership academy, because we recognise that there's a massive lack of leadership support for leaders within disability justice movements. And then also having an objective around getting other people to shift their money as well. So talking to funders and other INGOs about passing on more resources. So we feel like that's a role that AD can play. And I think if I was to say one thing to other INGOs, I think there's so many things that decolonisation can mean. And we're also doing internal work on how we work. That's kind of takes time, like culture change, thinking about how we work. It takes time. And I think of that also as being a bit about decolonising. And that's difficult and tricky work. I think the really big thing that AD can contribute is how we unpick that resourcing problem, which is a colonial problem, right? The problem of INGOs that are mostly headquartered in the UK or Europe or the US, holding on to money and very little of it trickling down to organisations of people with disabilities that are led by them in the regions where we work, which is Africa and Asia. That's a colonial problem. That's replicating colonial structures, and that's the thing that we want to intervene on, that we think AD can make a difference on in the next 10 years. And we've actually also said that we don't even know if AD needs to exist after that. If that funding flow really works, if we can persuade lots more funders and INGOs to put their money where their mouth is and actually shift resources, AD might not need to exist. But right now, there's such a problem with that. There's a very, very, very tiny percentage of funding, so tiny it's hard to calculate, because we know that human rights funding, very little goes to those groups that are actually led by people who are affected by the problems in general. And then to disabled people in Africa and Asia, the funding flow is like 0.0001%, so small. that if we could significantly affect that, then AD might not really need to be here. There's no need for an INGO if the funding gets there and activities are happening and things exist. And there might be need for us to be something different in the future. But so that's how we've thought about decolonising in our new strategy. It's very much about how we can interrupt something that we think is harmful and do something differently instead.
Thank you for that. And I like, also go ahead, Fredrick.
Just maybe a quick one around sometimes the way people are stifled from not knowing things, that means you're not making progress. And we think for the longest time that persons with disability haven't been given information about how you run your organization, how you resource it, and then how you work on your things consistently, including resourcing, that then you can effect change. And we think by training, supporting disability justice activists who have passion and have formed organization, then we can unblock that aspect of colonization, because by stifling them from learning, it means that they are perpetuating the same scenario whereby they are left there so that they don't know anything. And within the funding circles, you'll hear that these organizations of persons with disability are weak, so we can't fund them. And so for us to make them that they are now not weak, so it means we have to train them, we have to skill them, we have to mentor them. And this is now the work that we want to do through the Leadership Academy, because no one has cared to do that, yet we always claim within the development sector that organizations of persons with disability are weak, so they are not worthy of these particular resources. And as a way of decolonizing, we want to invest there massively so that we have activists who understand what are the root causes of their issue and how do you attack, how do you do advocacy, that now no one else can come to them and say, oh, you didn't know how to run your organization, that's the reason why we are not funding you. We think that's part of decolonizing that particular space.
Yeah, well, thank you, both of you. You've given quite a detailed description of how you want to do it. And I'm really glad to hear that it's a multiple pronged approach. It's not just the funding, but I'm also hearing it's about training leaders up to that and how you're going to impart the different kinds of messages that are needed. And yeah, I'm just really glad that you're able to do this, not just from one point of view. So thank you about that. My next question actually somewhat leads into that, in that this is really about how both of you are in your own ad. So the question is to both of you, and Fredrick, as we know that we cannot separate out race in terms of that maybe you might consider yourself Black. So race, gender, and disability. These are labels that I'm assuming that might have been assigned to you. Whereas for you, Mary, your labels of race, your whiteness, woman, and being able-bodied are the labels that you two carry. Given your assigned identities, can you share your experiences as individuals working in the civil society organizations? What impact have these experiences had on you? Fredrick, would you like to take the first stab at the question? Do you understand my question? Just make sure that you got that, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's true, I am someone with a lived experience. I have a physical disability. I'm Black with Kenyan origin.
So Fredrick, would you mind sharing what your disability is so we can be quite clear what that is? That would be great, thank you.
Yeah, my disability is a physical disability. So I lost the use of my limbs. So I walk using calipers and two crutches actually. So this presents a particular scenario whereby traditionally it has never been used to see someone with a disability taking up a leadership role, especially in terms of decision making, and especially in an institution that is meant to support persons with disability. So coming here and working with Mary Ann, while the board has already made those particular decisions that we're going to have a leader who has a lived experience and the other one, so that they're kind of complementing. While internally, the mechanism is set for that and everyone understands that, our peers, because we also work in an ecosystem of other organizations, I think it was the hardest for them to believe that AD was serious about the changes we had signaled that we are making in terms of co-leadership, having someone with a lived experience within the top leadership of an organization. And so you could go to a meeting and someone will say, but how does this work? Does it mean that Fred is the deputy and Mary Ann is the CEO? And even though all of us, we've worked in the past, we understand how the development sector is skewed in terms of north-south. That only helped us as far as internal, but then it means that within our ecosystem, we have to explain the reason for co-leadership is that it's a shared role, that Mary Ann plays the same role as Fredrick, and we have the same mandate from the board. We are doing one job role. It's not a divided job, because co-CEO is a one role that then we report to the board as one role, not two entities. And so it takes time. And over the time now, of course, we've been on this for over a year and a half. So people have understood now, but it took time before they got. Initially, the fact that I'm Black, I have a disability, that wasn't an expectation that I'm actually a co-CEO for this particular organization. And so conversation upon conversation and letting people know that actually when Mary Ann is not in, you can actually see Fredrick for a decision. When Fred is not in, you can see Mary Ann for the same decision, and you won't need to hear from the two of them. So it took time for us to play the explaining role, which shouldn't be if people understood it. But then that's just the way it is, because within this space, it's not expected for someone with a disability to show up as the leader, the main leader within the institution.
I can just imagine it must have been quite a jolt to people's sensibility to see, you're a Black man, and a Black man coming from Kenya and a disability. I'm also clocking my own internal slight resistance, because to be truthful and to be really transparent, I haven't met anyone in a high profile leadership position who is not only Black, but a disability. So I'm checking my own internal sense of, wait, I've got to kind of clean my glasses here. This person is Fred, and that he can do the job. So if I'm struggling with this, and at least we have the Blackness and that to be similar, it is the disability that I am having to openly accommodate. And I feel like I have accommodated. But the initial jolt, when Kate sent a picture where you're in a wheelchair, it was this thing. So I'm really glad that you're actually talking about that, because it is real. And then it also means that you too have to make a slight accommodation, because there is a slight to you also. So thank you, Fredrick, for bringing that up. And Mary Ann?
Just thinking, I was busy thinking about the experiences that Fred had coming into this role, and some of the things that people said to you, which were sort of implying that, and how that came from all different directions, that people make that assumption internally from people who are here in the UK, but also from people on the African continent. So like you were saying, Charmaine, and owning the way that you experience that in your body, like that, I think was very real. And what is my experience? I think, so obviously people aren't surprised that there's a white lady running an INGO, right?
and able-bodied, right? And
yes,
because that's a huge distinction.
So I don't have any of that experience. So I think the experience I more have is around trying to work out what the right role for me is, and the right places to step back or not speak so much, but also to not let that stop me doing things that I need to do. So there's like that kind of, I work a lot with white leaders in INGOs, so just outside of AD, because we both work part-time for AD. So I have 2 days when I do coaching and leadership. And I work a lot with white leaders who want to be really intentional around how they think about shifting power and decolonizing. And it brings up all these internal questions about how we behave, and trying to find that place of right relationship and right responsibility in yourself, where you're contributing and you're being you, and at the same time you're thinking about your impact on others, and also thinking about, and I think we do think about, Fred and I, the impact of different decisions we can take as a co-leadership team in terms of who does certain things, right? So who starts the meeting or not, or who speaks more in a certain moment or not. And we don't always get those right. And it's a constant kind of navigation of that. And then there's also like our personal tendencies, probably are, of course, formed by experience of the world and the labels assigned to us, but also who we sort of innately are, even without those labels. So there's quite a lot to juggle in that. But for me, it's very much around trying to be in right relationship and allow people to really accept that we are doing this role together, and hopefully see that that is possible. It feels possible to me. I hope it feels possible to you as well, Fred. I think most of the time it does. Like anything, it's hard sometimes, and there are difficult bits sometimes. And sometimes one of us has to do more on something than the other, and it makes the juggle of balancing harder and all of that. But I think the experience of being a white, able-bodied person working in development at this point of history, I think has to be one of like reflection about where you should and can show up. Because I also do kind of inherently believe that there has to be a role for white people in dismantling, but that role can't just be deciding what to do about everything. There has to be something else. And so I think the navigation of that is something that I sort of daily present to, and sometimes get more right than other times,
So the next question is number 4. So the first part, I was really asking you, what's it like for you to be in this organization and working with a civil society organization? Now I'm just going to focus the lens a little bit closer and ask you, if you can reveal, what's it like for both of you now, Fredrick, with your disability and your race and your gender? And within those things, there are the power dynamics that maybe not be named, but they're going to be there anyway. And what's that like, Mary Ann, for you, being a white woman with no disabilities, having now to co-work? And can you kind of talk about, if anything, where you've had to actually navigate that, where something broke down and it didn't quite work, but you have to go and talk about that and come together? So is that possible that you can sort of give a personal example? Because really what I'm trying to say, if you two can't work through those things, then how can you guide the organization to work through the same things with other people? Because I really do believe it first starts with us, the internal world, and how the two of you need to work in progress. So whoever would like to go first. So I'm asking you to share a little bit to the audience.
Yeah, I think the benefit that we've had with Mary Ann is because we've had many years of working together, even before our current roles, and just found ourselves that we're now working at AD. And so that was kind of easy to be more honest with one another. And if there's anything that is not working, just talking it up and finding time for us to connect and discuss it and find a way of going through it. But perhaps
I'm just going to hold you. Can you be a little bit more open? And I know I'm asking you to reveal maybe some secrets that you don't want to, but just so that the audience can get a sense of what kind of things that you two had to navigate. Yeah, because I think that's really important that we get a sense of, because when you say we have to work on things, I really am not sure what kind of things that you're working on. And I think the audience would also like to know. I know I'm asking you to be a little bit more open, and I know it's a challenge, but if you can think of something, a real concrete thing that you've had to work through, I really appreciate it.
I would say, for example, if something has gone wrong, perhaps just a little bit from what we anticipated that it wouldn't be that way, you'll find that the default now in my case will be that who gets asked is Mary Ann, for example. Yet we share a role. And the fact that you'll try to insinuate that perhaps someone is thinking, if I asked Fred, maybe the aspect around disability will show up or something like that. And for us, we can actually know amongst ourselves. We'll even try just to seek ourselves out and say, but I don't think if this was right. But yeah, and then if the other one understands it, will say, no, I actually understand it, but I think problem was mine, because we own up from our using the channel that we've established, that ordinarily it wouldn't go back to whoever said or something, but then we'll find a way of fixing it for next time, because we'll say, no, then for us to avoid something like that, let's put in this particular mechanism so that it doesn't always look like if something goes wrong, me or the other one. Because the tendency, since we're in a space within an NGO that is registered in the UK or something, the first person to take blame should be Mary Ann, because she is in the UK and I am in Kenya. Why actually that is not true, because it is the CEO to take blame, and the CEO is Mary Ann and Fredrick. And so then the assignment then becomes like, oh yeah, because she's white and in the UK, then she's the one taking the blame, yet the blame is supposed to be shared between me and her.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Mary Ann, can you give us
a couple? What we'll say is that we don't disagree that much. And I think that's because, as Fred said before, a vision level, very committed to the change that we're trying to make. And I think that matters, because I think that helps us to navigate when there's a small misunderstanding or we disagree about a decision or something. Because I think if you don't have the relationship and the alignment about why you're here and what you're doing, it would be very difficult. But those things help a lot. They make the biggest difference. I think we are open to discussing if something's difficult. So I think all those three things would have to be there. So I think if we didn't have those things, this would be really hard. It doesn't currently feel really hard because we have a good channel of communication between us. We talk quite a lot about what should we do about this and that. And so most of the time when we're interacting with staff, we've already agreed what we both think about it. So that really helps the navigation. A thing that I think I struggle with, and I don't know if this is a gendered thing or just a Mary Ann thing or a personal psychology thing, is that I have this tendency to feel like I need to carry a lot of answer all the emails and carry some stuff and push it. I will do extra hours so that I get stuff done on a Friday and things like that. And there are definitely other women that experience that all over the place. And I'm sure there are men that experience it too. But definitely there's a tendency in me to basically do too much. And that doesn't help with this balance of us. So what I'm trying to check in myself is stop trying to do too much, let it be. Don't have to answer every email. So that's something I'm trying to work with in myself. And I think when we talk about it a bit, that may be about gender, it could be about whiteness, it could be about Mary Ann. And the thing is, I think in the individuals, those things are all merged and messed up. So my mum was a bit like that too. And also, of course, my mum was a white woman as well. So that would be one example of something where I'm trying to actively take less responsibility for the things like answering every email and be a little bit more hands-off things, because I think it's better for our co-leadership and for other people if I do that. So that would be one thing. Is that fair, Fred? You can please respond.
Yeah, would you like to respond to that, Fredrick? How does that or not impact you? That this lovely white woman feels like she's got to do everything?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we've talked about it. It's true, because then she feels that we need to move everything at now, and then it ends up that then she gets to work more, and then it'll show up actually, when you do that. And that's just really to a disadvantage, because it means just more hours and getting into more, as opposed to just saying, oh no, I've reached my limit for today, let's work on it another time when I'm scheduled to do that or something like that.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I know that was kind of a tough question, that a lot of times we don't actually get those tough questions, but I just wanted to give you a hint too, because if I'm asking you to be transparent, just that Kate and we have very different personalities, and my neurodiversity is that I'm great at talking, but do not ask me to write full sentences, right? It's just painful, and it's like, so oftentimes with that, I do feel really insecure about that. And so the backlash of that is that sometimes I won't answer Kate's amazing emails because I can't formulate the questions, right? I can formulate it in my head, but I can't write it down. So then Kate, who's a doer, and she's great, she's on it, she moves. So it comes back where she said to me just yesterday, Charmaine, you need to answer your emails. You know, it's taking you 2 weeks. It's like, okay. So there's one of those things that we want to work together. And I really do like working with this woman, but my own disability, in a way kind of hijacks what Kate wants to do. So she and I, then we have to renegotiate some of the ways that we want to work. But if we don't negotiate and we don't find the right language, then the organization that we have, which I think is just absolutely fabulous, doesn't get to move along, and then we don't complete the goals that we want. So that's why I'm asking, how are you guys working out these things that might feel subtle, but actually they do impact in the goals that both of you want to have for ads? So thank you for that. I just wanted to give a little bit of clarity and sort of opening.
Sorry, and I think one thing for people listening, which is that we have a quarterly meeting where we talk about how we're working together. It just might be useful for people if they're in a similar situation. So we try and set aside some time to talk about how we're working together, because obviously we meet every week, but we hand over to each other. So there's always like 10 things we've got to talk about of what's happened on the days you weren't there. So we don't get to all this sometimes. So we try and have that quarterly meeting that's a couple of hours where we take that step back together and talk about these sort of things. And then my not trying to get everything done is a progress. And I think about it as important for the co-leadership to try and work with that. And there are others. And we're then increasingly trying to think about how can we talk to our senior leadership team about those things so that everyone's able to have a bit of that reflective practice. Because I think we basically need to talk about these things. So I'm with you, Charmaine.
Yeah. Kate, over to you. But if you'd like to weigh in on that, I think that would be wonderful. But I just want to say thank you, Mary Ann and Fredrick, for answering and for disclosing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that was a fascinating conversation. And what it indicated to me is that you've got all the practical layers of working together as co-CEOs. And then behind it, you've actually got some solution-oriented approaches like your quarterly meetings. But you've also got your personalities that are there. And I'm definitely an overdoer. And what I've discovered is the more I work, the more work I create, because you're creating new streams of work all the time. So I absolutely admire anyone who can knock off when they're supposed to and close their laptops and put down their pen and all of that kind of stuff. Before I go ahead with the planned questions, I've got a very quick comment that I want to make about hierarchies of disability and lived experience, because I have a son who has a complex disability. He's neurodiverse and has a cognitive impairment and mental health problems. Disability is so complex that he actually doesn't live with us at home anymore. He's in a 52-week placement. And when you're talking about the lived experiences of disabled people and having people with lived experience working with you within ADD International, I'm very aware that my son will never be asked to lead a disability organisation, and he'll never be able to advocate for himself either with policymakers or with anyone else. So he's going to be relying on us to advocate for him. And I just wonder, because I'm very aware that there are so-called hierarchies of disability in the disability movement, and it's an area of contention. And then you've got hierarchies of colour and colorism, and then you've got hierarchies of power that affect both of them, and then you've got hierarchies of organisations. And I suppose I'm turning this into a bit of a question. I just wonder whether is wrestling with these issues around hierarchies of disability, colour, power and institutions in the way that you work.
Yeah, not that we put our mind to it very strongly, but there's been, of course, in the past, the accusation that how can you have an organization that is said working with persons with disability and doesn't have persons with disability representation? But the working formula is towards saying that, yes, you need to have a mix of both, persons with disability, but also people who are passionate around disability issues, all of us working together, because there is no way in this society we are going to have 100% of something. But we have to find a common ground in which all of us are working towards a common purpose. And so the issue for us is that all of us are committed to supporting organization of persons with disability. We also now know that as organization of persons with disability, or within our families, we have allies, we have people who gets it. We have our parents, and for those people with the disability that have high support needs, you have their parents as those who are advocating for them. And they are genuinely interested in how the movement works and how the ecosystem works out to support both their kids, their friends, their siblings. So having that understanding, everyone comes to this sort of work with different things that then are leading them to be here. And sometimes what we've tried out at AD is asking people, what brings you to this work? And it is interesting, you'll find out why all of us are committed to the same piece of work, even though others will not have lived experience, but perhaps it's their sister or a friend of theirs that has some sort of a disability. So all that are welcome, and it's the only way that then we get to solidify why actually we need to move more resources to organization of persons with disability, because then it will be easier to make it happen if we identify that one thing that brings us to this particular work. And disability is not only one of them.
Thank you very much, Fred. I'm going to move on, unless, Mary Ann, you've got something that you'd like to add at this point.
It's just very briefly, the way that we've thought about different hierarchies of disability is that in our new strategy, and AD's done this for many years, to think about the participation of lesser represented groups of disabled people. So we've set an intention to resource those groups. And I think in terms of our staffing, I just wanted to clarify that our founder originally committed to 50-50 staffing, but we found AD in a state where it was only, I think, less than 15% of our staff were people with disabilities. So we're now at 22% of our staff. So what we're trying to do is move back to at least 50%. But as I was saying earlier, that takes some time. And within that, we've put in place quite a lot of refreshed policy around how we support different needs and the reasonable adjustment for them and so on. So I think we're trying to make sure that we have a range of people with disabilities with different needs and experiences amongst our staff and the people that we support going forward. But it's definitely a work in progress. But please continue now, Kate, sorry.
Thank you, not a problem at all. So you've talked a lot about representation and the importance of representation. And I'd like to link that in to your work on participative grant making, because it's very clear that unless you're giving, and you've said this yourselves, unless you give the money to the people who are working right at the coalface on disability issues, unless you give it to the right people, you won't get the best work taking place. And also the resources are being siphoned off and retained inappropriately in the global north. So can you tell us a little bit more about the participative grant making approach that you're implementing in ADD International, and why you think it's an important part of decolonising your practice?
Yeah, so our board made a decision to move towards participatory grant making as part of the new model through the transformation process that they'd already decided on about a year and a half ago, I think it was. We felt that was, as you said, the best way to ensure that resources and the decision-making power to what to do with them would be with organisations led for and working on the issues of people with disabilities in the regions where we work. What we've done is committed to that being one of our key strategic aims in the framework for the next 10 years. And we're actually moving away from any direct implementation of programs. So we currently have programs that we're responsibly exiting from, and then the main mechanism of getting money and resources to the activists we support will be through this participatory grant making mechanism we're developing. What we've currently done is piloted a fund for youth with disabilities in Tanzania. So we've got some learning from that. It was actually just shared as a case study by Ringo, the Reimagining the INGO project, and we can share that in the links, because it's got some good learning about what we learned from that. That was a small panel of youth with disabilities who made decisions about funding for some work in Tanzania. But we're about to launch a much bigger pilot of a fund for women-led disability justice organisations and activists in a number of countries in Africa. So this is a key part of our approach. And I think one thing that's different, maybe in my experience about AD from maybe other INGOs that are experimenting with participatory grant making, is that we're making quite a wholesale change. So we're not saying we'll just make it a part of our existing programs. We're saying we will phase out our existing programs. We don't think that the role for AD is to be implementing programs. And actually, we weren't really established as a program implementer. In the beginning, AD was established and invested in disability rights activists in different countries. And then over time, the funding shifted. There was less flexible funding available, and we had to get into programs. I think the leaders at the time just felt that was the only way to resource the work, but it moved us away and away from passing on resources to the movements that we support. And we think full-scale shift away from our own programming is the right way to go because of all the things we talked about. So we're basically in piloting. We're taking an iterative approach. So we don't have one approach. This is our PGM approach at this point. We're actually just trying out some different approaches with different pots of money. Some of that is very flexible money that we've been able to raise from foundations that understand the need for flexible funding. And some of it is where we've got existing programs and managed to identify a pot within it that we can use to make grants to pilot and try for it. But I think that important thing is that we will, over the next 5 years, shift entirely to this model. And we will, alongside that, support the leadership work that Fred can maybe talk about a little bit, and also what we've called movement support, which is really about how we can support people connecting. So maybe different grantees connecting, accessing networks and one another. So there's a sort of connectivity role that we think we can play, but we won't do any programming ourselves.
Great, thanks, Mary. And Fred, it was great to hear a bit about the leadership program that you're running.
Yeah, just before the leadership program, the other fundamental issues around why we made the switch is that while our establishment was to support the nourishment and nurturing of disability justice organization, at some point it became that we're actually competing with them to the same resources, while globally only 2% of all human rights funding goes to organizational persons with disability. And in that circle, we are actually privileged because we are registered in the UK. So you could imagine an organization here in Kenya trying to compete with us for the same resources, which is from 2%. So it means that then we were actually starving organizations of persons with disability from wherever they are, from the same 2%, already a marginalized figure within the overall funding in the human rights field. So the decision also is informed by that, because if now we become a facilitator, it means we are not competing with them, but actually we are using our privilege where we are from our registration and the networks then that we can try to amass globally now to create the flow that then these resources get to this organization without now competing. And it's the reason we are exiting completely from implementing, that then there is no direct competition. We are actually vouching for them from anyone who's having money to give, that then we can give it in a more sustainable way, that then also do not have a restriction. And why participatory is because then they let us know what are the priorities for these coming 3 years, what are the good organizations to work with or to support if you wanted to change particular policies that are supportive of persons with disability or women with disability or people with invisible disability in this particular region. And our focus being women with disability, young people with disability, because they haven't been supported enough, and those with invisible disability, because even within the disability rights movement, they kind of tend to be left behind. So that's more the reason why we have a participatory mechanism, but also exiting the implementation field so that we open up space and avail more resources to these particular organizations. Now, as an accompaniment, we think for these organizations to be sustainable, because we can only be able to give a certain level of resources, they also need to be now some sort of a going concern so that at least they can also fundraise on their own and have now multiple sources of funding. And through the networkings that we create, And if the leadership is trained and supported to understand, this is how you write a strategic plan, for example. This is if you wanted to influence a policy, these are the kind of things you need to do. And perhaps within that ecosystem, if we give them a mentor to help them run through those things, and now they have maybe someone on their team that understands fundraising, and we are creating some sort of events for them to network and link up with other movements, say women rights movement, LGBTI movement, youth with disability, youth movement, workers, then they're able not to be operating in silos, but then forming friendship with other movements, and then they will know where additional resources can be found and how to grow their networks, but also how to make their work sustainable and not just depend on art as a grant maker for them. So really, that's why it's important for us to accompany them with the Leadership Academy that then provides that facility for mentoring, training, and opportunity even for either interning in some of these already working organizations, so that then they see in a practical sense how it is done, and then they can go back to the organization and implement that, so that their advocacy issues become sustainable, they form networks, they get also other allies from different movements that then they can promote their work.
Thank you. Thanks for describing that to me. Now, I would like us to have a think about how we can give our listeners a practical sense of how they can contribute to change. At the end of the podcast, we always ask guests to suggest one thing that listeners and viewers could do to support shifting power and decolonisation, whether they work in the development sector or engage members of the general public. Fred, first, I wonder if you could suggest one practical thing that you think people could do to support this process of progressive change.
I think to support change, there's one thing that is in us that we can do, is just about changing our mindset around particular issues. For example, that this is something we can do, and we need to apply to ourselves to it, that we need to do it, and create some sort of an urgency around it, that then we are doing it, but we are not theorizing. For example, as AD, we decided we wanted to make a change. It started from the leadership. How can we ensure that this board has a representation of persons with disability to this level? How is it that the senior leadership is also recruited? We see, these are the things that within ourselves, when you decide, you follow up with an action, but don't delay the action in terms of making some sort of buying time. You decide, but then follow it up with action, because that's what is going to determine the next steps. And that's what is going to bring out the authenticity, that people believe that it's actually possible to change. And we are hoping that we can be a living example to other organizations that actually change is possible. You just have to start walking the talk. It's not easy, it's not smooth, but it's those challenges that gives you a learning on how you the change that you desire to see. So really change the mindset and begin walking through, and things should follow suit. Yeah.
Thank you, Fred. And over to Mary Ann. Would you like to add?
Yeah, mine is about embracing imperfection, which I think it sort of follows on from what Fred said about people should just start and get on with it kind of thing, which is part of what I heard you say, Fred, because I also hear a lot of CEOs and leaders in organizations saying they can't see an example and what can they do and so on. The answers to all of this would be different for every organization, because the organizational histories are different, current models are different. So, there isn't a cookie cutter. How do we change? And so I think there's something about embracing imperfection, because one thing we took on was looking at our salary scales, just one example, wanting to make them as equitable as possible across all the locations where we operate. We did a huge bit of work on it. We got external support. We've tried our best to make sure that we have a salary scale that everyone can understand, but it also had to be affordable for AD. We're a medium-sized INGO. We're not huge. We didn't have loads of resources to invest in changing our salary structure. And what we've come out with isn't perfect, right? It's way better than what we had, which was like salary scales in different places that didn't talk to each other, and there was no way of understanding any kind of equity. And so now we've got a scale where you can see how much you're paid, and it's on our website, whether you're a certain grade in a different country, and you can see all of that. But it's imperfect, and we're not paying in some cases as much as we want to be in all cases, because we didn't have enough money to push everyone up as much as we wanted to. So we had to make difficult decisions around that. And I think that's just one of many examples where we're trying to push for doing as best as we can and all the things we believe in terms of this transformation. And then there's like the practical reality, and we can't get it perfectly right. And so there's something also about embracing imperfection and accepting that if you set an intention to change your working practice, you're going to get so far at this point. There are so many other restrictions around, as people often say, funding, their boards, all these things. Set an intention and try and push for the bit of change that you can achieve right now, understanding that it won't be perfection. Because I think sometimes we get stuck in the idea of it's got to be perfect, otherwise I just won't try. And actually, that's not going to serve us. We're not going to see change if people get stuck in that. So that would be my word of the day, or my 2 words of the day.
I love that. Thank you very much, Mary Ann, because it's absolutely true. You've got to put a foot forwards, and then you've got to put the other foot forwards, or move forwards progressively on this journey towards decolonisation. So thank you for that. And I'd like to thank you both, Mary Ann and Fredrick, for joining us here today. And Charmaine, if you'd like to say last words as well.
I would just want to say thank you for both of you for being so honest and transparent. I did kind of push you a bit. And so I just wanted to add one tiny bit when I said about my neuro disability. And so the conclusion that came about how I can answer the emails faster, because like I said, there's a lot of shame in not being able to write. But by being able to be transparent, Kate just said so simply, blew my mind. Well, you can send me a voice tape through WhatsApp. Like, I had not even considered it. So I'm just, again, Mary Ann and Fredrick, when you say, what is that one thing that you can do? In our situation was to have the conversation that was difficult. And lo and behold, an amazing a resolution came about what I could do. So I really am embracing exactly what you guys are talking about. And thank you so much for being on the podcast with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. And I would like to remind listeners and viewers to check the show notes below for more on AD International and participative grant making. There's Fred's blog, a link to Fred's blog, which is a great read. And also information about AD International's commitment to decolonisation, which kind of goes through the commitments they've made